Tash, over to you, and then we'll do my usual preamble. But
Thank you, Chair. So just to remind everybody, if we could mute our microphones but activate our cameras, and just to let you know, Chair, we're now webcast.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Development Plan Panel. This is a remote meeting. I've got a few. I'm Councillor Neil Walsh. I'm the chair of the Development Plan Panel. I've got a few prepared words that cover all our administrative requirements. I'm just going to read those. For folk watching, I'm using my two laptops, so if I stare off to sort of this side, it's because I'm looking at all my papers which are on my laptop rather than having them printed out. So I'm not distracted by anything else. It's not like I'm playing solitaire on a screen or anything. More seriously though, folks, welcome to the meeting. This meeting meets the requirements of the Council's constitution, even though members of the panel are in remote attendance. While items today will be fully discussed as is usual, remote attendance requires a few slight changes how I will manage the debate. Therefore, I call on all attendees to mute their microphones unless I invite them to speak. This will avoid disruption from background noise. Can all participants please keep their cameras on during the meeting? All participants will be invited to introduce themselves at the start of the public session, as which we're in now, to make it clear to public observers who will be involved in proceedings. Members wishing to ask questions and make comments should do so by using the raised hand facility. I ask for your assistance and patience while I go through this process. So, as I'm chair, there may be some problems with internet connectivity. So I propose that we adopt a deputy chair who would step in during my absence. Now, at previous remote development plan panel meetings, Councillor Ritchie has agreed to step in, and I don't think that arrangement's changing. Councillor Ritchie, is that okay?
That's fine if the members agree.
We all happy with that? Good.
Chair, I'm having difficulty in hearing you. I can hear everybody else.
Well, some would count that a blessing, Councillor Carter, but just bear with me a moment. Thank you for letting me know. Just bear with. Is that any better?
Oh,
oh, sorry.
Absolutely.
Is that a little bit too much the other one? Okay, right.
Oh dear.
Famine or feast? Well, that's Headingley Labour Party all over. Right. Okay. So, Councillor Ritchie's agreed to be the deputy whip. We've sorted out sound issues. So now I'm going to introduce. Oh, I'm going to invite members and officers to introduce themselves. And could you mute your microphone once you've introduced yourselves? We're going to go in alphabetical order. So if I could start with Councillor Anderson.
Councillor Barry Anderson, Adlan Wharfdale Ward.
Councillor Arif.
Councillor Sam Arif, Gipton Hare Hills Ward.
Councillor Campbell.
Good afternoon, Councillor Colin Campbell.
Councillor Andrew Carter. Councillor Carter, we can't hear.
Councillor Andrew Carter, Leader of the Conservative Opposition and Member for Carvely and Farsley Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Collins is next on this, but she's not here. She is joining us as soon as she can. Councillor Finnegan.
Robert Finnegan, Councillor for Morley North Ward.
Councillor Finnegan, may I ask you if you could turn your video on, please? It's one of the requirements of... Well, legally,
I'm not that bothered, but there we go. Let me give the full benefit to everybody. There we go.
Dear Lord, turn it off, turn it off. No, I'm joking. It's a requirement of the Constitution.
If only.
Thank you.
Get on with proper work then.
Thank you so much. Councillor Caroline Gruen.
Hello, everybody. Councillor Caroline Gruen, Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Thank you. Councillor James McKenna.
Good afternoon, all. Councillor Jim McKenna, Army Ward.
Councillor Lisa Mulheron.
Good afternoon, Councillor Lisa Mulheron, Ardsley and Robin Hood Ward, and Exec Member for Climate Change, Transport, Sustainable Development.
Thank you. Councillor Ritchie.
Good afternoon, everybody. Councillor Kevin Ritchie, Bramley and Stanningley Ward.
Thank you very much. And let's segue into officers. Mr. Carr.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Carr, Head of Development Management.
Martin Elliott.
Good afternoon, Martin Elliott, Head of Strategic Planning.
David Feeney. Actually, planning officer disappeared. No, he's in the corner. Hey, David.
David Feeney, Chief Planning Officer.
Much appreciated. Thanks very much. Adam Harvett.
Good afternoon, everyone. Adam Harvat, Group Manager for Policy and Plans.
Nicole Walker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nicole Walker, Legal Advisor to the panel.
Excellent. Right. Thanks so much, folks. So could we move to agenda item 1? Tash?
Thank you, Chair. So under agenda item number 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item number 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press and public. Under agenda item 3, I've not received any formal late items of business. Under agenda item number 4, could I please ask members to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests? I'll take silence as none. And under agenda item number 5, I've not received any apologies of absence, but I am aware that Councillor Collins will be arriving late to the meeting.
Thank you very much, Tash. So moving on to agenda item 6 for the minutes of the previous meeting, 29th of July. It's been brought to my attention already that Councillor Finnegan is listed as both present and given apologies, and I think it was given apologies, so we'll amend that. Are there any issues raised with the minutes, folks? Looking at elected members here. No. Okay, good. Are we? I'm prepared to accept those as a true record of the meeting. I'll take your silence as an approval. And does anyone have any matters arising? No, good. Okay, so we've got 2 substantive items today, which are probably going to be the subject of considerable discussion and debate, and we've got time to do it. So what I intend to do is move on to agenda item number 7, which is the update on the legal challenge to the site allocations plan, of which officers are going to provide an update. So rather than do a huge preamble from myself, I think it better if we hear from Martin and Adam to start with. Chaps?
I'm going to introduce this item, Chair.
Excellent, Lois, far away. And sorry, I didn't ask you to introduce yourself. I'm really sorry.
You didn't.
Sorry.
It's Lois Pickering from Policy and Plans Group, but
Thank you, Lois.
I work closely with Adam and Martin.
I feel terrible. You weren't on my list.
It's fine, don't worry.
And Councillor Collins has now arrived. Don, do you want to introduce yourself for folks present?
Thank you. Councillor Dawn Collins for Horsforth Ward. Apologies, I was late. I was at a previous meeting.
That's not a problem. Thanks very much. Right, Lois.
Okay, I am going to be looking at another screen, so you'll see me side on.
There's a lot of that about today.
Okay, at the last development plan panel in July, an update report was given on the High Court challenge to the site allocations plan. But at that time, the judge had not ordered relief. In other words, what needs to be done to correct the errors of law that she found. So this report provides a further update now that the judge has ordered relief as to what this is and means, immediate tasks required and the process moving forwards. To recap very briefly, the Site Allocations Plan, or SAP as we call it, was adopted in July 2019, but was the subject of a legal challenge by Airborough Neighbourhood Development Forum, submitted to the High Court on the 20th of August 2019. Focusing primarily on release of greenbelt land within the Airborough housing market characteristic area for housing. The case was heard at the High Court in February 2020 and the judgment was handed down on the 8th of June. The judge found 3 of the 7 grounds constituted errors of law. These are summarised at paragraph 2.6 of this report and were around justifying release of the specific greenbelt sites and site selection process, and an error of fact relating to the calculated increase in supply of housing during the process. The High Court has now ordered relief, which was handed down on the 7th of August, and this can be seen in full at Appendix 1. The effect of this relief is that all parts of the SAP which allocate sites for housing, including mixed-use sites, that immediately before the adoption of the SAP were in the green belt, 37 sites, will be remitted back to the Secretary of State and the Planning Inspectorate for further examination. Paragraphs 2.8, 2.9 and 2.10 of the report explain the judge's reasoning behind this. She considered it appropriate that the process should be taken back to the stage at which the error in law occurred, rather than starting the whole process again through quashing the plan. She explains that it is for the council to decide if any modifications to the plan are needed, and that evidence may need updating to inform this. See paragraph 3.6 of this report. So during this remittal process, these 37 sites will be considered as not adopted, and as such will return to the Greenbelt until re-examined. The remainder of the SAP remains adopted and carries full weight. The 37 sites are listed at Appendix 2, with a plan showing their location at Appendix 3. Appendix 4 shows the effects of the judgment on housing supply across the housing market characteristic areas. Taking the Greenbelt sites out reduces the supply to 46,530 homes overall, which is a surplus of 130 against the new core strategy requirement. 8 housing market characteristic areas, however, are now in deficit of their indicative targets, and only 3 in surplus. However, as paragraph 3.4 goes on to explain, if we add windfall figures to this, there is a surplus or headroom of 3,880 homes against the core strategy review requirement, or 8% over the requirement. So there is sufficient housing land supply to meet the core strategy select review targets. However, this current position will need to be the subject of updated evidence to inform the Council's approach to the re-examination of the SAP, which will take account of an up-to-date housing supply picture, which may decrease or increase as a result of an updated strategic housing land availability assessment. Paragraphs 3.6 to 3.9 detail that officers have commenced work on updating the strategic housing land availability assessment, as this will underpin any further proposed modifications to the plan. The update will be informed by recent national planning policy announcements, current market adjustments, and any challenges posed to housing delivery by COVID-19. The other thing the report points out is that the High Court challenge has delayed the SAP review of housing allocations. Policy HGR1 of the adopted SAP requires a review to assess and address the need for additional housing allocations and safeguarded land designations post-2023, following the adoption of the core strategy selective review, which was adopted in 2019. Policy HGR1 states that the review should be submitted by the end of December 2021. As the plan in part will now be re-examined by an inspector, it is not possible to submit a review of housing allocations and safeguarded land by 2021 to address Policy HGR1. However, as part of the remittal process, the Council will in effect be reviewing the additional need for housing allocations post-2023, and as such, the work undertaken may incorporate the same work required as would have been through HGR1. If this is the case, the proposal submitted to the Secretary of State for re-examination could include a proposal that Policy HGR1 is deleted. This would have the effect of removing the need for a SAP review. This is detailed at paragraph 3.12 of the report. The important thing to say arising from the High Court challenge is that we do still have a 5-year housing land supply despite the judgment. The relief order has reduced the 5-year supply from 7.2 years to 6.1 years through removal of those 37 housing allocations. So the process moving forward will be to update the evidence base as detailed, in particular the SHLA or Strategic Housing Land Availability Assessment, to determine what changes to the plan in respect of the 37 Greenbelt allocations are required, taking account of the findings of the judgment and any updated evidence. to provide further update reports to Development Plan Panel on the updated evidence and proposed approach to amending the plan prior to resubmission to the Secretary of State, and to submit any proposals to the Secretary of State for further examination and subsequent adoption. So looking at timescales, paragraph 3.15 explains that it's estimated that the process for the SHLA work, which has started, can be concluded between 6 to 8 weeks. Following consideration of the data and evidence, officers will aim to bring a further report to this panel in December, updating members on the evidence gathered and the approach proposed to the site allocations plan work. As set out in paragraph 2.9 of this report, once the SAP is remitted, it will be for the Secretary of State to make the appropriate arrangements with regards to inspectors and dates and the process for any future examination proceedings. So time-wise, it's difficult to speculate. That concludes my report. Members are asked to note and comment on the contents of the report as it relates to the site allocations plan and legal challenge. Thank you, Chair.
No, thank you, Lois. That's very clear and comprehensive. Well, 2020 is certainly consistent in the hands it's dealing with through the inspector's error. We find ourselves in this, inspectors plural, this situation. So there is a mapped out way forward suggested by Lois. So what our role here is we want to make some comments on that process, suggest a path forward, that kind of thing. So I think something from my own perspective as chair, just to say, we are also at the moment, folk need to bear in mind, we are also at the moment in the middle of undertaking a local plan review. Thanks, Councillor Carter. I think that's an indication to speak, yeah? Yeah, I'll bring in a second. And the focus of that local plan review is the ongoing climate emergency, which despite the events of this year has certainly not gone away. And folk have been keeping up with the news on other things apart from the coronavirus. It's a very clear and present danger. Now that's a central strategic objective of the council and of the city. And my own view as DP chair is that we shouldn't detract from that process insofar as much as we can. So folk need to bear in mind, I think, that when they're considering this. So I've had a couple of indications. So Councillor Carter, do you want to come in first, and I'll look for other folks?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I mean, I suppose you would expect me to say this, and I've been very much involved with this over what I can only describe now as a 10-year planning shambles, culminating in this court case. And to be frank, it's no good just saying, well, the inspectors got it wrong. The inspectors came to their conclusions because of all the evidence presented by your administration. And so you can share the blame equally. The sad thing about all this is that 37 Greenbelt sites were certainly the most sensitive ones of them, were needlessly put at risk because we still have a 6.1 year land supply. It also appears that there is a total new homes with planning permission outstanding of 29,000. That is the highest capacity in over a decade. And it leads me to believe that if you had accepted our recommendations through the core strategy review and the SAP process, that a lesser total figure was required, there wouldn't have been the need for the most sensitive of these Greenbelt sites to be included. And furthermore, that would have led most probably to no legal challenge. So this is a hugely self-inflicted wound. The only plus side is that we now know that we still have a 6.1 year land supply, but there's no ducking or diving about the responsibility for this. It lays with yourselves. So what concerns me now is the speed at which we can move the process forward to ensure that we don't have a hiatus which leads the speculative housing developers, who I'm sure will be tuned into this meeting, circling sites which we don't want to see built on, and they do. So there is a need. There is a need to move with speed, although I think the way forward that is now painted in the report is probably the only way forward. Two additional points concern me of detail. First of all, throughout this process, 10 years, the council has based its assumptions on a very, very optimistic level of economic growth. If it was ever likely to be that high in the first place, it certainly isn't now post-COVID. And I do hope that officers are going to properly look at economic data when coming back to us post the schma. The other point is that I'd like some reassurance about what discussions are going to be with ward members. I have a couple of specific things I want to raise, but I think I'll leave it at that for the moment. But I do want to come back on two specific areas which I think there are errors of fact in the report.
Okay, I mean, thanks, Councillor. I mean, I do not particularly wish to rehash the seemingly endless debates over housing numbers that have occurred in this council over the previous 8 years that I've been involved in the planning side of things and involved in the development plan side of things. Suffice to say that the lower numbers that were presented successively would never have been accepted by a planning inspector. And certainly the higher figures that our friends in the development sector were put forward would never have been expected by a planning inspector. And at all times, this administration has been evidence-led. And I think the common thread, therefore, if you want to look for a common thread, is the overweening power of the planning inspectorate and its impact it can have on cities like ours and our communities. It's almost as if an over-centralised planning system is perhaps not the way forward. But we'll come to that later. Councillor Mulheron, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair. Indeed, we will be coming on to the national potential of imposition of numbers, the next item. But I think just to say a few things. First of all, that officers have presented evidence. It hadn't been shown in the inspector's report. I think that's a key point to be made. So the allegation that officers of this council hadn't done their jobs properly in terms of presenting that information, I think needs to be refuted. And what we're up against now, of course, is what was actually written in the inspector's report, which is where the judge has found fault, and a reference back effectively to the planning inspectorate to put that right. I think, you know, in terms of a couple of positives to come out of it, if this is done correctly, it could prevent us from having to go through a SAP review. We clearly have got the 5-year housing land supply still, which is very welcome. Do note, obviously, that that 5-year housing land supply is delivered effectively by the city centre and inner areas, delivering way above their requirements, and outer areas delivering rather less of that. So in terms of having that availability of housing for all of our communities, for people who want to kind of be able to buy homes near the area that they grew up in and to live in those communities, that presents a challenge. But we do have the 5-year housing land supply, which is hugely good news for those of us who were at the mercy of that in previous years and had the speculative development that we don't want to see imposed upon us. And the fact that we hopefully, without a need for a SAP review, once we've got this part of the process out of the way, can move forward in terms of developing a proper local plan that has all of our priorities and the needs of the city in terms of delivering our strategy to tackle the climate emergency at the heart of it. So I'm keen not to be going back through a lengthy process that we've all been through and bear the scars of over the last 7 to 10 years, and to actually be able to move forward and get the sort of housing we need in the city that meets the challenges of the future and tackles our climate emergency.
Yeah, thanks for that, Councillor Henry. Yeah, I completely agree. I think making progress forward is the way, ho forward. And effectively, the quicker and simpler we can make that process, the better. There are other things on our mind, like you said, climate emergency. Does any other member want to come in at all? Councillor Anderson.
Can I come in, Chair?
Councillor Anderson and Councillor Campbell. Yeah, of course.
Yeah. There's a number of things. In terms of paragraph 2.9 of the report, where it part of the way down, it says this is a commenting from the judge. What approach the council takes to exceptional circumstances. Can I suggest that we have a clearly set out definition as to what the council means? And I do mean the council. I don't just mean me or you individually. I'm talking about we need a collective view, and it's clearly set out so that people know what to measure things against. Okay, if we could have that. Then in respect of paragraph 3.4, in terms of windfall sites, we need to try and keep the public fully informed here, and Appendix 4 doesn't actually clearly set out where the windfall sites were and how they're being dealt with in terms of delivery. So can that be looked at? And whenever we take any forward figures in terms of Appendix 4, that further clarity and explanation notes are put in place. In terms of paragraph 3.6, fine. I note that the council are carrying out a SLA assessment, but should we not be carrying out a SMA as well to find out where the actual needs are so that we can justify, you know, let's say for argument's sake, you were wanting to put some of these greenbelt sites back in again so that you actually have evidence to show that there is a need in the areas that you're wanting to do, you want to put them in. So in other words, we have, because again, that's one of the problems with the community is that they don't always see where the need is coming from. And it's just a way of, you know, learning from lessons. You know, a number of people have mentioned today that we've got scars. Well, mine's are very, very deep because I started off this when Mr. Feeney and I were arguing against the regional spatial strategy. So I go back some time on this one as well. And the other thing as well is on the sites, the greenbelt sites, can we revisit the sustainability of the sites, bearing in mind the new world that we've got? So there is less emphasis on the economic sustainability of sites and more emphasis being put on the environmental and social sustainability of sites. I attended a presentation this morning where a number of people were pointing out that the way of getting sustainable development is not building where there isn't transport links, for example, because we're expecting people to walk more, we're expecting people to cycle more. And so that's one of the points I'd make there. And also on the sites, if you are bringing them back again, can you set out very clearly what the infrastructure needs are of those sites? You know, we could be doing with it done on most of the sites in the SAP, but we've not got an opportunity to do that. But we would have an opportunity to clearly set out, if we do take forward these greenbelt sites again, what the actual infrastructure needs are locally, and so that these can then be agreed with local ward members, and then at least we are having a better idea as local ward members as to what's going to be expected from us. Now, the other things are that's been brought to my attention in terms of Appendix 4. why are we not setting out the actual number of houses delivered in each of those HMCAs? So that we can actually see where the shortfall, it talks about certain shortfalls, but you may actually find that some HMCAs have actually just about produced their target already. And also, there is a degree out there amongst the people in the public who do understand this process, that the inspector in the past has mentioned that we should have taken into consideration delivery from 2012 to 2017 as well, so that people are aware of what's happening. Because if we want to keep the public on side, we've got to start making sure our information is clear. And at the moment, Appendix 4, in my view, provides more cloud than it does clarity in the way that it's presented. It's factually correct. I am not disputing that it's factually correct, but you need other additional information to understand where it sets in the context of things. Now, in respect of the HMCAs, certainly Adam's aware, and I think Martin was copied into correspondence from one particular part of the city about clarifying and querying what's happening with the HMCAs. Are there going to be any reviews, and also the targets therein? This goes back to a debate that Councillor Carter and I initiated at the review, where we were asked to, argue the case later on about changing of the HMCAs, because that was going to come in. And at the time, I think Mr. Elliott and Mr. Feeney agreed that that was something that was going to be looked at in the future, and the inspector noted that. And people are wanting to know what's happening with that in terms of things. So I'm sorry that that's been a long go at things, but I've tried to be positive. I've not tried to, be negative all the time. I've tried to come up with some sensible ways of making this process better for us all, because we are all deeply scarred by it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. That was quite a list. Let's try to unpack some of that for you. Councillor Campbell, if you don't mind, I'll bring you in after we've attacked some of these, because there's quite a list, which there's nothing wrong with that, Barry, at all. But and I appreciate you trying to be positive. That's good. Right. So opening up to officers regarding Windfall sites. How will we put Greenbelt sites back in, although there's no intention to do that at the present time or in the foreseeable future? Sustainability of site infrastructure, the table regarding the number of homes actually delivered, and the future of HMCAs. So who wants to pick up?
I'll start, and I'll let Adam and Martin chip in as we go along. I'm going to work backwards, I think. Housing market characteristic areas, reviewing them. It's been a topic of discussion for a long time, and it was raised in the examination at the core strategy selective review, and the inspectors accepted that they should remain. I mean, that's not to say it can't be discussed at some future point in some review of the plan at some future stage, but we're talking here about remittal of the SAP under the ruling of the judgment, and that doesn't involve reviewing HMCAs. That would be a whole lot of other work, distracting us from the job in hand, which is purely to look again at those 37 sites and have those re-examined. Appendix 4. Windfall is the second to last column, new sites which are not in the SAP currently. And that's added in simply to give the overall balance, to show that we are in surplus. That table really is meant to be purely a factual statement as to what effect taking those 37 sites out has in terms of numbers. It doesn't take into account past delivery. It's purely an indication showing what happens from taking the sites out, and with a different plan period starting at 2017, whereas the site allocations plan start date is 2012. So it doesn't account for any of that. That's not to say that moving forwards, when we decide what we're doing with the SAP, we won't include that. This is purely a factual factual statement of what the current situation is at this moment in time. If we decide we have to relook at those sites and we want some back in, then obviously through the examination process, the inspector will need to be happy that she is content that the sustainability appraisal that was done previously and the infrastructure needs are fully taken into account. However, our sustainability appraisal that was done previously, the inspectors found sound, and we did consider economic, environmental and social factors in assessing all sites as we are required to do currently. Infrastructure needs as well. We covered that, and the inspectors found that to be sound in terms of the infrastructure delivery plan and site requirements on individual sites regarding specifics related to specific sites. Yes, of course, if we're going back into an examination, we will have to address exceptional circumstances again and balance that up against whether we think there is a need for these sites to be in or out of the plan. You asked about whether a SHMA should be done as well as the SHLA. The SHLA is done on an annual basis anyway, and we need it to give an accurate picture of delivery, which does take into account the economic recession and effects of COVID. The SHMA, if there is a need for any other evidence that members consider is needed to inform the remittal process, then yes, officers would be willing to consider that. But the SHMA was part of the evidence in the core strategy selective review and has also been considered and found sound by the inspectors very, very recently. I agree fully with what Councillor Mulherin said about we want to move forward. We want to get the SAP remittal work done as quickly as we possibly can, so we can move forwards with local plan review and looking at climate change. In terms of the other points that were raised about the risk of speculative development, we do have a 5-year supply. So in the short term, we should be able to defend speculative development. But yes, I agree, we need to get on with the SAP work quickly and remit to the inspectors as quickly as we can to make sure that we continue to have a 5-year supply. A question was also raised by Councillor Carter about discussion with ward members. Yes, we will be doing ward member briefings with members, and depending on the scope of the site allocations plan, once we have the updated evidence, if there is a lot more work involved, then yes, we would be involving them as we did all the way along with the site allocations plan. I think I've covered the main points, but I'll let Martin and Adam add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Lois. That's really helpful. Martin, do you want to come in at this point to pick up anything, or is it?
I've got nothing to add, Chair, but I think Chief Planning Officer has got his hand up.
Excellent. Martin, your hand is up on my screen. Thank you. Mr. Feeney.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Lois. I mean, just in response to members' concerns about the time scale, I mean, just to make members aware, I have actually written to PINS about the remittal process and urging the need for speed in terms of supporting the council to move its local plan process forward. And I've had a response to that letter inviting me to attend a meeting with them, with colleagues, to talk through the process. So in terms of moving things on, we want to be on the front foot with this and work at speed and agility, given the priorities that the council has in terms of the local plan review, as well as addressing the outstanding matters in relation to the SAP. So I just wanted to clarify that point, Chair.
No, thanks. That's enormously helpful. Timescale, I'll get my teeth in here. The timescale matters hugely. It's good to have that clarified. Councillor Campbell, then Councillor Ritchie. Colin.
Thank you, Chair. I wish we had more ability to use hindsight in planning. It would have saved us a lot of trouble. And just to put on record, we did say you didn't need the greenbelt sites, but I won't labor that point, because I'm sure we'll end up talking somewhere else. Can I just ask a couple of questions?
Sure.
One is in relation to the SAP review, because it appeared from earlier conversation that in effect, we're going to get lost on these housing figures again. But it seems to me that there are other elements to the SAP review that need to happen. And I was just wondering if it actually is a requirement that we do it. I'd be interested to know, perhaps from a legal point of view, whether we're at risk from developers who have, I suppose, taken out options on land, which, to all intents and purposes, until the judgment, was developable land. I think the housing characteristic areas, my memory was that the alterations we were talking about to the housing characteristic areas were not major changes, but I suppose minor changes to make them more reflective of what's happening on the ground. But I assume that if, looking at Appendix 4, if we take the greenbelt sites out altogether, presumably we'll have to create new sets of target figures for the housing characteristic areas. So one or two of them have got, on paper anyway, a substantial shortfall. So I'm looking at outer south, outer southeast, outer southwest, where we're in excess of 1,000. That presumably we're going to have to produce a new set of target figures for them, or presumably developers could come along and say there is a considerable shortfall here. Could we use this site to meet that shortfall? And I would agree with Barry. Appendix 4, now you've explained it to me, I think I follow, but it is a bit, I think it could do with some extra note for any member of the public or or even another councillor to have a look at. So I'm just interested in those questions, Chair.
Okay, yep, thank you very much for that. So it's the scale of the SAP review, indeed a legal view on that. So I'm going to bring Nicole in a moment. Possible action from developers, landowners with options on their sites, and a new target figures required for the HMCAs. I mean, just very briefly for myself, I mean, I think there is always, as we know full well on this council, there is always landowners and developers circling around looking for opportunities. That's the nature of the beast, as it were. I think the process we're setting out really keeps the sort of the aperture of weakness as small as possible, and that's the right and proper way forward from my point of view. Nobody wants to put communities through the stress of predatory actions by landowners and developers. Scale of the SAT review and a legal view on its requirements. Who wants to pick that up? Nicole, do you want to pick that up from a legal perspective, or Lois from our process? It's up to you guys. I'm in your hands.
Chair, I can come in with regard to the developer question, if that's helpful.
Please, yeah, that's very helpful.
So as soon as the local plan is adopted, then it is that, but it's not without risk until the appeal period has expired, and that either no challenge has been forthcoming or any challenge has come to an end. So from a developer's point of view, that is always a risk.
Yep.
And obviously any developer has the right to bring a challenge if they want to do that, or challenge the decision if they want to do that. Now the period for appeal expired on Friday, and we have not been made aware that any party has made an appeal to either the relief decision or the substantive decision.
Okay, so what's the timescale of that period? Just refresh my memory.
It was 21 days from the relief decision.
Right. Okay. Good. So, okay. HMCA new target figures, officers.
Just if I can just come in on that.
Please.
We argued throughout, well, we put the case throughout the SAP examination that those targets are indicative only. not prescriptive, and that would be the case moving forwards. So I don't necessarily think that there would be a need to create new targets to deal with the SAP remittal. Yeah, I don't think I need to add more to that.
Okay, that's great, Lois. Thanks for that. Colin, is that good so far? Yeah. Any comeback or?
I noticed that Northwest Outer, which Larry and I represent, are actually in credit, for want of a better word, of 13 houses. So I'm hoping you're not looking at us for any more.
Yeah, don't spend it all at once. Councillor Ritchie, then Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Chair. I do think it's important to make the point that the judges ruled it was errors of law made by the inspectors, and now as a local authority we're picking up the pieces of that and the cost and resource to deal with that. But I just want to touch on a couple of points that have been kind of mentioned, and it's the unbalance of the housing what's the word? Allocations, sorry.
Yeah.
Went blank there. The unbalance of the housing allocations across the city, where we've got this massive surplus in the city centre and the inner areas. And I just wondered what risk that brings to us if developers don't develop those sites. Would that then put pressure on our 5-year land supply, and look, those predatory developers then could try and pick off some of these greenbelt sites in whatever order they choose? And the second point is, I think Lois has reassured me that the SHMA is updated every year. But even anecdotally, we know that there's a housing need in those outer areas where young people want to stay in the places that they've grown up in. So there is some requirement for housing out there, and this unbalance of the allocations, I won't forget that in a hurry now, I've remembered it, will could have consequences for us, but I think it worries me.
No, I think it's two good points you raised there. It does bear repeating that it was the errors in law by the inspector rather than the council that have caused us to be in this situation. So, Councillor Ritchie's point about the imbalance of locations, can we have a response to that one, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that one, Councillor Chair. It's absolutely right. Yes, there is a risk there, and that's really the primary purpose of the SHLA, to kind of test market feeling for the delivery of that pipeline in that area. As Appendix 4 demonstrates, there's a huge supply in the city in the inner areas over and above the target set out in the core strategy. And so the SHLA will be used to test that supply essentially. And COVID-19 is obviously has huge implications, which we need to be very mindful of. And we need to make sure that what our supply is at the end of this process is robust to ensure that we can maintain a 5-year supply over the duration of the plan period.
Okay, I appreciate that. Councillor Collins, and then Councillor Anderson, I appreciate you want to come back. So, Councillor Collins.
Yep, thank you, Chair. I welcome the fact that you said you didn't want to put the greenbelt sites back in for now. However, if the developer or if the owner of that site or a developer chooses to, they can still put forward a planning application and try and justify the planning on that greenbelt site under the exceptional circumstances. I would support what Councillor Carter says, that we need to seriously and quickly review what exceptional circumstances would be for us. I know of at least one site where planning officers have already gone back to the developer and said, you can no longer automatically build on this site because it's been taken out. But if you tell us what the exceptional circumstances are, we might be able to give you planning permission and move forward in that direction under those terms. So can we not do something fairly quickly as a body to say what might be acceptable to us under exceptional circumstances? if it's just affordable homes, I don't think that's pushing our developers far enough. I think there have to be targets regarding affordable homes, what percentage. I think there have to be targets regarding what they're going to do regarding biodiversity, targets as to how they're going to improve the infrastructure and the road network around them. And I think we need to do that fairly quickly. Otherwise, once one planning officer is accepting a proposal from one developer, it could have a cascade effect. And we might not actually get as good a deal as we could if we'd addressed it quickly. We have had the climate emergency for over a year now. We have been pushing officers for new policies, but we still haven't got them. So I'm just very concerned that even with ambition, sometimes we don't actually get the paperwork behind us to support what it is we need. So can I have some feedback from officers, please, as to whether they think that's a potential opportunity for us to get something in writing and how long it would actually take to do that? Which will come first, our officers' report, or all of these sites will go forward under normal planning rules?
Thanks for that. So lots of work has been going on regarding climate emergency. I can assure you of that. There has been a small margin for a global pandemic. In the meantime, 2020 is a giving year, as we've clearly established. I think it'd be useful to get some clarity from Chief Planning Officer about exceptional circumstances that might ease elected members' furrowed brows on that. So, David, if you want to speak to that, that'd be really helpful.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, other colleagues can comment as well, but just to differentiate, in terms of plan making, in order to release sites which are designated within the green belt, the local authority, through its evidence and through the plan, needs to demonstrate exceptional circumstances in there being a need to do that. So there's a plan making exceptional circumstances. In relation to dealing with individual planning applications, housing in the green belt is inappropriate development by default, and should a planning application come in by an individual developer, they would need to identify and demonstrate very special circumstances in order for that application to be considered as acceptable. So there is a distinction there in terms of plan making and in terms of considering individual planning applications.
Thanks. That's yeah. Okay. Does that help, Councillor Collins? You want to come back on that?
Not really, because we know that. What I'm trying to establish is what the planning officers would accept as exceptional circumstances. I know that each individual application has to be seen on its own merit, but there should be some sort of overarching sort of request from ourselves as to what we think would be exceptional circumstances, and have some input from the councillors, just rather than an individual planning officer looking at each individual case. What does Mr. Feeney believe that we could put on that list regarding exceptional circumstances?
I'm not sure if I misheard you, Councillor Collins. I think you might be conflating exceptional circumstances and very special circumstances. Exceptional circumstances are through the plan making. So we have to be able to demonstrate that there's a need to release the sites based on the evidence we're putting forward to an inspector. In relation to individual planning applications, it's for the promoter of that scheme to demonstrate the very special circumstances for inappropriate development in the greenbelt. And in terms of the appropriateness of development in the greenbelt, that's set out in national planning guidance, which sets out the sorts of development that you could ordinarily accept within the greenbelt, such as open recreational uses or ancillary facilities relating to agriculture, etc., etc. So it is prescribed in national planning guidance. But in terms of setting out what we think are very special circumstances for housing in the greenbelt, we wouldn't do that as a planning authority, because the onus is on individual applicants through their proposals to demonstrate to us, based on their information, what they feel the very special circumstances are. We wouldn't want to set criteria for that, given what's set out already in national planning guidance.
Thanks for that. Appreciate that, David. Councillor Anderson, you've got a point to pick up on those suggestions, then it's Councillor Finnegan's turn.
Yeah, it's just coming back to something that Lois said about infrastructure. With someone who sits on 2 different plans panels, that's one of the major areas of contention that we've got when we've got cases before us, is that residents often argue that there is more infrastructure needed for the X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. And when we've tried to probe that, we find that there isn't actually a lot being set out by strategic officers when the site was coming forward. And that then constrains what we as a plans panel can actually do in order to meet some of the needs that a local community come up with. We are actually, in some cases, partially take on board the points that residents make, and sometimes fully take on board what's been said. But we are advised that there's not a lot more we can do about it. We've got what we've got. So if that's there, how can we get the development control officers to start using your information then if it's there? Because I cannot recollect once a report coming forward from development control saying that strategic officers have said this site needs X, Y, and Z so that we can be sure that it's actually done. It's up to ward members or members of the public to actually point out to the plans panel that it hasn't been done. So how can we get development control officers, when they're in discussions with developers, to actually insist that these things are put in as a bare minimum? This is the starting point, and then work on from that for the additional needs that are needed to meet local communities.
Folks, response, please.
Just come back on that one, Chair, if I may, Martin.
Please,
Martin
yeah,
Elliott.
thank you, Martin.
So I think Councillor Anderson raises a point that we're very cognizant of, and as the SAP did, this remittal will have to address the infrastructure needs of the sites, should the evidence suggest that they be proposed to be taken out of the Greenbelt. Now that comes in a variety of forms, through highways modelling, through flood risk assessment, through education needs, through green space needs, where the council can have a control over the delivery of that infrastructure, and the housing provider can have some control over that. So what you will see are site requirements in association with the sites that are in the site allocations plan that detail the infrastructure required. As members will know, there are some elements of infrastructure that the council can't have control over, but in such instances, for example, in the healthcare sector, the council's working very closely to front load and have a dialogue around a pipeline of development to enable the health sector to provide adequately to meet increased residents.
Okay, Martin. Yeah, thank you for that. Look, folks, I want to move things along. I've got Councillor Finnegan and then Councillor McKenna to speak, and then I want to wrap this item up. So, and then I think Councillor Carter had some specifics to raise as well. We'll come to those as well. So, Councillor Finnegan.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points to be made. We've been banging on about unrealistic housing targets for forever, and certainly we're against them in the regional spatial strategy. We've been against them since. We are in this mess because of unrealistic housing targets. We've been consistent in our opposition to that, but this is more of a specific issue. At Appendix 4 in the outer southwest, which is where Morley resides, we have new sites not in SAP AVLLAAP of 350 new homes. Now, I'd be curious to understand where that site is. And the other question to officers is, taking into account Morley has had to bear the best part of 2,000 new homes either being built, have been built, or are going to be built in the very near future, then what assurances do we have that Morley won't be asked to accept yet another dose of significant housing numbers purely to deal with what was not our foul up in the first place. Thank you.
Thereby raising a spectre of a problem that doesn't exist. But if officers want to briefly reply to the specific questions that Councillor Finnegan
Chair,
raised.
could I just come back? I mean, I'm
Sure.
happy to email Councillor Finnegan
Yeah.
on the details of that windfall number. It may be that that's not one specific site, but a number of different sites. But I just think, stimulated by that question, it's important that members understand that this is a judgment, not a choice, for us to remit these policies back. So we will need to work within the adopted policies that this council has, some of which have been recently adopted, as has been pointed out, through the core strategy selective review. Yeah,
I completely agree. And members should know better to raise strawman arguments of problems that don't exist. Councillor McKenna.
Thank you, Chair. Like some members have said, it's been a journey lasting 10 years, and I was on that journey from the very beginning. We visit every individual site and we come to a sensible conclusion. But what underpinned this review was that every housing characteristic area would take their fair share of housing. And if you look at the outer area, with the noble exception of outer northwest, as Councillor Campbell has already said, there's a shortage, a huge shortage of nearly 6,000 houses there. You know, that can't be right. We would be in dire trouble now if it wasn't for the inner area, city centre, inner Leeds and inner area. They have produced more than 10,000 houses above their requirements. Not only have they taken their own allocation, they've included an extra 10,000 houses. And there's a very basic unfairness to this. You look at places like Airborough, which is obviously the topic of conversation at the moment, which I've driven through many times. It's one big green field. There's green belt all over the place. In where I live in Army, Bramley, and your ward, Headingley, Chair, and Alma's Heralds. You know, I remember my clients once saying to me in Vermintofts that the only bit of green in my ward is the Irish tricolour flying over the Irish centre. And, you know, he wasn't far wrong. No. It's basically very, very, very unfair. And nobody has said that. And I think I should say that. It's all right, even Councillor Finnegan wanging on about Morley. I lived in Morley. There's plenty of green spaces in Morley. There's very little in my ward. I won't repeat that again. Very little. Now, my way of thinking, Chair, is, and we are where we are, I accept that. We are where we are on this one. But what we need to consider is when we have applications in the inner areas that we have to ensure there's plenty of public open space around them. This week on planning, we had the privilege of nearly 8 weeks of work where the Tetley's Inner City Park came on stream. I think we have to think more of that. When planning permissions come to Caroline's South and West, to Kevin's North and East, and to my own, that we have to look very carefully that these places, these houses, these new developments need to have plenty of green spaces where the local people can at least walk their dog if nothing else. And the kids maybe have enough room, just enough room to provide them with a playground. If we don't think along those lines, Chair, we are letting down the vast majority, the most deprived areas in the city down very badly. But we're protecting Greenbelt in areas that people from my ward, your ward, Salma's ward, Kevin Ritchie's ward, Caroline's ward, they'll never have the pleasure of enjoying. There is something very, very, very basically unfair there. And I'll finish on that line, Chair, but I want you to consider that, and I want every member to consider that, because it's something I shall be watching in the future. Thank you.
Well said, Councillor McKenna. I mean, this, as Mr. Elliott said, this is a judgment that's legally handed onto us, not a position where we'd want to be in, ideally. There has always got to be equity and fairness in how we go forward, and that's what we've endeavoured to run as a council, isn't it? A fair approach to make sure everyone's got every community has the homes we need. This shifts that somewhat, it's fair to say, but I think as we go forward, we'll need, as you say, the green space we need and the right housing mix that we need. And it was a proud moment when City Park came forward at City Plans, and I was proud to be on that panel. But you're right, we've got to get this right. We've relearned a lot of things in the last 6 months, and I think we've relearned about quality of life and the importance of green space. And I hope developers who are watching intently this broadcast will take that to heart. It's a huge concern for us all. Councillor Carty, you wanted to pick up some specifics, but I'm wondering if that might be better done with an exchange with Mr. Elliott and Lois, perhaps, outside of this meeting. Councillor Carter has disappeared.
Not really, Chair, because the factual errors.
Okay, well, yeah, pick them up by all means.
Yeah, okay. Before I do that, I have to say that this must not get into a debate about sacrificing green belt or depriving people in inner city areas of green space. It's not what it's about. And the question I asked at the very beginning has still not been answered. I appreciate why nobody wants to go back 10 years. But as somebody once said, in the beginning, there were over-optimistic economic projections, and from those have stemmed all the difficulties that we have faced throughout. I asked specifically whether officers were now in their deliberations looking at the current economic situation and the fact that even when times were better, the economic growth that was being projected by the council way back when the core strategy was first devised were ever met. And we know the answer to that was no. So I do want an answer on this economic situation. And to Jim McKenna, for whom I have a great deal of respect. To be frank, Jim, if you've driven through Airborough and not seen the havoc and the traffic, then I hope you weren't behind the wheel, because it'd be a wonder you didn't have an accident. It is the A65 and the road through Guiseley, and it is just chock-a-block because of all the houses that have been built. So let's not play one area off against another. The specifics of these, I refer to Appendix 4 and back to this business about windfalls. Outer West, 50. I raised a couple of years ago the issue of a large site in Outer West, over 120 dwellings, which was never an identified site, has been completed during this plan process. And yet for the whole of Outer West, we have 50. Well, I can take you to a site of 120 at Dawson's Corner, flats. Where are they? They aren't a site that's ever been mentioned, but it's a conversion of office accommodation into flats, right adjacent to New Pudsey Station, very sustainable, nobody objected, but it's reflected nowhere. So please don't tell me that in Outer West, in total, we've had a windfall of 50 when we've got 120 there on its own. The second point, go to the map that's supposed to identify the greenbelt sites that have been now taken out. And I refer you to HG 42, HG 43. Now, when I look at the list of sites that were in the green belt, The table does not reflect those two sites at all. And I think there's a mistake, because I think those HG 42 and 43 were in fact taken out before we agreed the SAP. Now, can someone tell me whether I'm right or I'm wrong? Because if I'm right, you know, with a question mark over the accuracy of what we're being given already.
Okay. Can we speak to Councillor Carter's question, or does that reply an email response going away and coming back?
Chair Martin Elliott, I think it does warrant an email response going back on the detail. It may be that the Dawson's Corner site actually is one of the HG1 sites in the SAP, but we need to clarify. We need to clarify.
We do need to
that.
clarify, but also I think that we need to just double check. But I think that Windfall position is it Windfall since 2017, so it may depend on the year it was delivered. But we can check and clarify.
Well, I'm sure we can clarify that fully to Councillor Carter's satisfaction.
Was Councillor Carter referring to HG 242 and HG 243?
Yes, I was.
Right. Those aren't listed as Greenbelt sites to come out, are they?
No, they're not, but they are on your map.
Right. Oh, okay. Right. We will check that. We will have a look and check.
Well,
just to clarify,
please.
Yeah, I'm sure officers will reply in a speedy manner. Who wants to speak then? Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. It's
me.
Sorry.
Are those two sites not in North Leeds? Are they not in the table under North Leeds?
I was just wanted to clarify. They are in the table. Yeah. They are listed in the table.
In North Leeds. I don't know why, if they're correctly in North Leeds, but that's where they're in the table.
You're correct, Councillor Anderson. They are in the table. They're under a different housing market characteristic area. They're not part of Outer West, Councillor Anderson, Councillor Carter.
Right. Okay. I think that's topped and tailed that. I think if there's any further detail needed, officers can supply that to the members in question. I don't.
Chair, sorry, could I just go back to, because
sure.
Councillor Carter did make the point that his question at the beginning of the meeting wasn't answered around the economic situation and the housing numbers. So I just really do need to clarify that within the remittal of these policies to the planning inspectors, there is no room to change the core strategy policy on the housing requirement. And just to remind members that the housing requirement is set to last for the plan period, and that is through different economic circumstances. Now, the economic circumstance we're in at the moment could not have been foreseen, I suggest, and the pandemic wouldn't have been foreseen, but the work on the SHLA is going to provide us with clarity on the impact of that on the housing market in Leeds. But what we won't be able to do through the remittal of the sites to the inspectorate is change the target.
Yeah, thanks, Mine. That's helpful. Is someone else trying to speak and it's coming through very well, or is that off-camera noises on someone's feed? I don't know. Anyway, so that was a detailed discussion about this, folks. Right at the start, Lois set out a way forward. We've discussed various items. We haven't substantively come to a position that would change that way forward, and I propose that we move forward on that basis. Councillor Collins, you wanted to come in? Feel free.
Thank you, Chair. Very quickly, HG 242 was in the SAP and is now coming out because it's Greenbelt. Yep. There was one on the other side of the roundabout. I think it was HG 241 that came out initially. HG 243 is Greenbelt, and that's the one that's around the old college site, and that has now come out of the Greenbelt. But that one is one of the ones that's at risk because they might be able to argue special circumstances on. So, and they are all in the north of Leeds.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. It's most helpful. Right, folks. On that note, I think we should move to our next agenda item, which is the planning white paper. Now, for our huge potential audience viewing on the World Wide Web, information superhighway, etc., etc. Government's proposed a planning white paper, and that's going out for consultation, which we will be responding to as a city council, and as a development plan panel will make a huge contribution to that response. So obviously going to speak to the paper in the moment. The white paper's proved really rather controversial so far. There are some significant changes, potential significant changes looming to the planning system. But there's also a lot of items that are rather vague and to follow and to be confirmed, etc., within it. So the debate today will be built around that purpose. But I mean, there seems to be two schools of thought on the white paper at the moment. I'll bring the officers in a moment, but two schools of thought seems to be this is a anti-democratic, over-centralizing power grab by Whitehall, or that this is a developer's gift to bring in lots of low-quality, bland, overcrowded developments. And I think really, folks, as a development plan panel, we need to bring a synthesis of those two positions forward and see if we can make some progress. So, Martin and Adam, who is leading on this?
Thanks, Chair. Sorry again. I think this Robin Coghlan was going to do the intro on this.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try and be very quick. I did have something for about 10 minutes, but I might try and shorten it.
Fine.
Really?
Robin, you're not on my screen, by the way. Oh no, you've reappeared. Sorry, my Zoom's caught up.
Good.
Fire away.
Okay. So it's a major shake-up of the planning system that's been proposed. The consultation runs till the 29th of October. I won't go through the report para by para because there's just far too much. So I'll try and go through the headlines and with possibly a bit of questions and comment, and I will definitely try and take less than 10 minutes. So the white paper is set out as 3 pillars or topic areas. There's planning for development, beautiful and sustainable places, and then planning for infrastructure and connected places. So I'll just go through each of those in turn. First of all, planning for development. There's quite a lot of proposals in this pillar. First of all, is the simplified designations of land for growth, for renewal, and for protection. There's quite a bit more detail that I can go back to if members would like. I think our concerns with this are that there is a lot of complexity on the ground, and how can that be so easily simplified into 3 zones? And what would happen to our existing designations like housing allocations? The next major thing is a proposed set of national generic development management policies. And the broad intention here is to try and avoid duplication of local plans having the same set of policies. Again, a sort of question for us is, well, what extent will local variations be appropriate, and what sort of examples are there in Leeds that we would need to have our own flavour? There's also a proposed revision to the standard method of setting local housing requirements according to a national formula. And there's a separate government consultation on this to bring in some sort of immediate changes. But the white paper talks about factoring in land constraints and opportunities as something for the future, I think. And then it proposes a much more streamlined system for dealing with planning applications and also quicker plan preparation. This has a number of features like digitalization and standardization. There'd be mandatory time limits for planning application decisions, and planning application fees can be repaid if appeals are successful. And it's proposed that plans be prepared in just 30 months. And this would include much more visual plans that are more accessible to the public. There'd probably be less formal public consultation. There's a replacement of a number of the sort of standard processes like sustainability appraisal, like duty to cooperate, and the tests of soundness. As officers, we've got a few concerns about whether there'll be enough opportunity for consultation and local democracy in a sort of streamlined system, and how would neighbourhood plans fit in, and also what about devolution? Will that replace the duty to cooperate? You know, the proposal for a mayor of West Yorkshire. So that's a canter through the first pillar. The second pillar, beautiful and sustainable places. It's got an important role for design codes, there's basically, this means there'll be no need for planning permission. So if a proposed development accords with the code, it can be built. So again, there's some questions around this. Democracy, is there time for local consultation, you know, upstream in the plan making process? And are there the resources and the time to do a proper job with genuine local consultation? Also in this pillar, there's some proposals for the environment, but they're not very definitive. There's proposals about safeguarding historic and natural environments and going zero carbon by 2050. And it says in particular it will clarify in the autumn how far local authorities can go in setting their own more ambitious zero carbon targets. And I mean, in terms of implications for us, the aspiration in the white paper for zero carbon by 2050 doesn't really accord with the council's aspirations, which are more ambitious for 2030. So, you know, we have to wait and see in the autumn what's being proposed in terms of what local authorities can and can't do. And then finally, the pillar on infrastructure. It's proposing to replace the Section 106 and the community infrastructure levy system with a single levy. And the key features here are that it would be levied on the final value of development at the point of occupation. It would allow local authorities to borrow against future receipts to provide infrastructure. It expects affordable housing can be provided on site, and it will apply to all development, including permitted development, which would probably be a good thing. So just, I mean, in conclusion, I think this is like a starter for 10 really from the government. There's a lot missing. It's kind of expecting local authorities to fill in the gaps. You should also remember that there are other parallel proposals being put forward, or that have been put forward, like for permitted development rights that are being opened up. There's a lot of emphasis on speeding the planning process up. I mean, I think officers do have concerns. How much will this be at the expense of, you know, involvement of local communities and councils? So as officers, we've been putting together a response, but we very much welcome members' opinions on the best way to respond. And then we're hoping to bring a detailed draft response back to Development Plan Panel in October. That's me done. Hope that wasn't too long.
No, Robin, that was that was excellent. That was concise and to the point. And after hearing Robin's summary, I refer you to my opening remarks regarding what this white paper potentially represents. I give it a cautious 1.5 out of 10 at the moment. However, it has got to go out to consultation when it faces, I would imagine, significant hurdles, and it's already engendering some significant opposition in local government circles of quite most political parties, to be fair. I've got a couple of councillors to come in, but I just a point from myself as chair. Councillor Carter, don't worry, I've got you. It's all right, you're on my list. I've got Councillor Collins and Councillor Carter, but just to say from my own position here as both DP chair and SEAC chair, it needs saying and repeating, and it will form part of our consultation response, that a zero carbon date for new homes for 2050 and a zero carbon date of 2050 for the country as a whole is utterly meaningless. It's a figure plucked because it's mid-century, I suspect, and it's far enough away that current crop of politicians and senior civil servants won't actually have to deal substantively with it. There's no scientific basis for zero carbon by 2050. 2030 is where we need to be aiming at, and that implies significant change on our society. 2050 is completely meaningless, and it's your regular reminder panel that if the Sustainable Homes Code adopted towards the end of the noughties hadn't been junked, we'd already have looked at well over 400,000 zero carbon homes being built in Britain. It's not difficult to build zero carbon homes, but that kind of lack of commitment from the government is what happens when government is too close to developers and too close to the worst end of the development sector as well. And I think we all know it on this panel. There are some further issues with it doesn't address infrastructure, doesn't address actually affordable housing, which is very different from the government's definition of affordable housing. And as Robin's highlighted, there is such an anti-democratic street running through this that it's a recipe for real discomfort in our communities. So given that preamble by myself, I've got Councillor Collins, then Councillor Carter. Don?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I sort of agree with you regarding the policies that the government's proposing to write for us, because I don't think we can really comment until we see them. I think if they are too wishy-washy, then we'd be far better off having our own policies. So I agree with you that we need to know that they're going to have teeth. The second point I'd like to make is this all sounds great, that we're going to have beautiful homes and beautiful estates, but we're not going to actually be able to achieve all of those if the developers actually still want to take a huge profit margin, because if it costs them more to build it, they're just going to push that back onto the homeowner. The third point I want to make is regarding infill. I agree with Councillor McKenna that we do need to put more green space into our urban communities. And if this white paper reflects what's also in our core strategy, that there's going to be a preference for infill, where are we actually going to put all of these community small gardens and green infrastructure? I think we'll miss a key opportunity there if we allow those to be filled in. There was a fourth point, but I've forgotten what it is. So, but yes, my understanding at the moment is that this white paper could have had a lot of positives, but I think because there's a lot of uncertainty behind it, it's going to be very difficult for officers to comment on.
Yeah, we will have to do a consultation response based on what we know at the moment, and there are a lot of vagaries. But there's enough, if you like, macro points to be extremely alarming, I think, for anyone who's interested in the future of the city. Councillor Carter.
Yes, Chair. I make no apology for the fact I'm going to talk at some length on this, because I think this white paper is a massive missed opportunity. I have spent the last very many years arguing against central direction on planning matters. It began, well, it's existed for donkey's years. It got worse under Tony Blair. It got even worse under Gordon Brown with the Barker Review. David Cameron continued it, and now it seems it's continuing further. And I think there's a fundamental reason for that. The fundamental reason is that the Treasury are convinced, without any evidence, that local authorities deliberately stop house building. And they don't. 6 or 7 large speculative house builders stop house building because they control the tap. We had the Letwin review, which in my view was, and I make no apology to my own party for saying this, was a complete waste of time. His study into land banking was a piece of, well, it was not an in-depth piece of work. Otherwise, he would have found out exactly what we already know. What we should have seen in this white paper is an acceptance that as long as a cartel of speculative house builders are allowed to continue holding the tap of housing supply and insisting on a net profit margin which no other industry expects, we're not going to get what we want. And what worries me about this white paper is that battle lines have already been drawn up and no sensible debate is being held. And I regret to say, Chair, I've seen Councillor Mulherrin's white paper and it bears out precisely what I've just said. Next week, we will lock horns on planning issues and lose complete track of what we ought to be doing, and that's engaging with the government in the most robust fashion. And accepting some of the things in the white paper are actually quite helpful, but that we're united in believing that decisions are better made locally. You know my comments about the mayoral authority and planning powers there. And it was one of our red lines to the government on devolution that we wanted a veto putting in there. And whatever officers or indeed your colleagues may tell you, that veto is in there because of what my group and other Conservative groups in West Yorkshire said to the ministers. The Treasury don't like that. There's all sorts in this paper that can be that can be rebutted. There are things that can be agreed, and I have a horrible feeling we're going to miss the opportunity of putting something forward that all political parties can agree upon. Now, I say this as an absolutely committed free market Conservative. I believe in competition, but I don't believe there is competition in the housing market because of the fact there are this large cartel that can effectively price fix. They don't operate within the free market system. So therefore, I would advocate a land tax on the increased value of land, which becomes housing land from whatever else it previously was. And that land tax should go to local authorities to provide, on the strict understanding, absolutely strict understanding, that it is spent on infrastructure. By doing that, you immediately begin to address a lot of the concerns we heard in the debate earlier today about the general public's view of the lack of infrastructure, which in most cases is absolutely correct. And it gives the local authority money and indeed less of an excuse to not provide the infrastructure that new developments need. And that's completely missing in this white paper. And certainly whatever the council does, I shall be making my representations on those fairly controversial things I've just said. But if you believe in the free market, then you can't believe that one section of the free market is protected and therefore is no longer a free market and excludes competition. I'll give you an example. In the financial crisis, the large 7 or 8 builders stopped building and land banked and squeezed out smaller developers. That is a fact. So consequently, we've even less competition now than we had before the financial crisis. And I think some of you will agree with the comments I've just made. And what I'm saying to you is that we ought to be constructively going back to the government on this, and not in the sort of you've said it so it must be wrong attitude that so often pervades our discussions. Because as Robin Coglan almost admitted, there are some things in there that actually would be quite helpful to us and we would agree with. And actually, the standard methodology for house numbers, providing it's not an imposition, could be very helpful to us, and particularly helpful in reducing house numbers that we don't need. And I'll leave it at that. But I would strongly suggest this, that you might want to consider that we have an all-party working group to respond to this of a very few members that meets in camera and to see exactly what level of agreement we can find.
Thank you, Councillor Carter. I think the controversial bit from that was the land taxation. I think you were reading from the Labour Party manifesto from last year, but no, there's clearly going to be a reasonably fair amount of consensus on this, and certainly areas of common concern, and hopefully that'll be borne out how we go forward. I think using DPP as a basis for a working group to help craft a response would be a useful and good idea. I mean, I can't honestly see a huge number of local authorities putting forward a largely positive response to this white paper, judging from what friends in local government around the country are saying from a number of different parties. There's an enormous amount of disquiet, and I think we're starting to see why it is vastly concerning on just about every level. Robbie's pointed out like that there's small elements that are improving. That's almost the nature of a white paper, really, isn't it? It'd be rare for government to get everything completely wrong, despite the last 6 months having many examples of that. But we will try to move forward in a positive way. And on that note, Councillor Rich, you're next. Then Councillor Campbell.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to touch on the element of the reduction in elected member involvement in planning decisions. And by that, it also includes the people who we represent, the public.
Yeah.
And that does give me great concern. As a planning chair, one of the decisions that we have to make, as you all know, is when councillors bring requests for referral to panel when they disagree with the officer's delegated decisions and the like, and obviously there has to be a planning reason. But again, that demonstrates, and often they are turned over by plans panels, and I think our record on appeals is pretty even, judging that they are finely balanced decisions. So we lose that element. Also, I don't think it's in the paper, but I think it's in the white paper that with the move to digital, there'll be no need for lamppost notices. Now, that might seem a minor, trivial point. However, certainly in my ward, I think Councillor Gruen will agree, we've only had small sites, infill sites, but quite often people complain that they've not seen the site notices. And we do know that actually Leeds goes above and beyond our statutory requirement on notices. So I still feel they're an important element to play in the system. And the final thing is that with the abolition of 106, just referring back to the devolution debate, and I read the papers prior to that, the scrutiny chair's input and so on, there were lots of references to section 106 in that and the assurance that it'd stay with local planning authorities. I just wonder if there were any concerns that the new levy that's proposed might find its way to the mayor rather than the local planning authority to develop the infrastructure as is kind of agreed in the devolution deal. That might be a bit off-piste for this meeting, but it is a question I wanted answering at some stage. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Have we got a commentary from officers on that, on the questions Councillor Ritchie raises? Is there anything we can say at the moment, Martin, Adam?
I'm not sure, Chair, that there is anything. I don't think the white paper gives us any clarity, and certainly from what I know from the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, they're still working out the processes by which strategic infrastructure will be funded that supports the sub-region.
Okay, yeah, it's like I said, it's a white paper, but there's a lot that's a work in progress, which gives an opportunity to respond as a City Council and jointly or as individual political groups regarding that. I think it's really important we do that. Next up, we've got Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief, actually, because I found Councillor Carter's critique and suggestion actually excellent. It really does reflect most of my views in relation to this proposal. And it goes back to something we've said for some considerable time. And that is that, unfortunately, the developer community has the ear of government. And I think there are too few government ministers or even MPs who've actually sat in a plans panel and seen the excellent work that most plans panels do in relation to trying to promote sustainable, reasonable development that reflects the need of their community. I don't think we're going to end up, if this goes through, with a better planning system.
No.
We'll certainly end up with a system that produces more profit for developers and more costs to local authorities.
Yep.
That said, as Andrew did say, there are a couple of elements of this that I think are useful. The phrase beautiful, which I notice appears in several places, is one of those things that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but at least it does require some sort of effort to try and make something look reasonable. And I think his comment about the standard methodology for housing need, given those of us who've spent the last 10 years of our lives struggling with this, is a useful thing, because it allows certainty within all local authorities and effectively doesn't allow developers or authorities to play off one against the other. But certainly I would support Councillor Carter's suggestion about a small working group, because it's quite difficult to respond to so many points in an afternoon like this. Thank you, Chair.
No, that's good points, Colin. I mean, yeah, I think a working group's the way forward. It's going to be by its very nature, it's quite time limited, and let's see how we can make some progress, get some consensus across there is a lot to respond to and a lot of questions we need to ask ourselves. I've got Councillor Anderson and Councillor Mulheron.
I was going to mention what Councillor Carter did about the working together. The reason I'm coming at that angle is that I think this is an opportunity for us as a council, as well, it'd be a moot point between us and Birmingham as to which one is the prime planning authority. And I think if we can make a coherent case that has cross-party support, and bearing in mind what we're getting in terms of devolution as well, I think this is a great opportunity for us to actually, instead of, it's easy to carp, I can criticise this white paper as well very easily. But what about putting down what we would like to see, what we can positively do? Give us the powers and we will do this. Your neighbourhood plans, a good example. If the government beef up neighbourhood plans and the weight that can be put on them, then I think you get a lot of communities in Leeds backing other changes. And also it's got to be give and take. That if we are getting some of the things we want, we've got to look at what other people have got criticisms of the system. At the moment, a lot of residents do not understand the planning system and get very frustrated when they listen to plans panels, that they feel that sometimes they've not been fully listened to. So I think we've got to look at how we can reform ourselves as well. And the final thing I was going to say is that personally, if you want to have regular meetings almost every week in order to get this right, I think a number of us would be willing to go that extra mile to help you to do what you're doing, because it's so vitally important. And some of us have complained about the planning system. As I said, I go back to the regional spatial strategy when I was having a go at the way that planning was being developed in those days. We've got to get it right. I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to get it right. The government, you can criticise them for the number of U-turns, but they are also a government who do listen to what the public are actually saying and react accordingly, to be quite frank. And it's maybe something that we need to utilise so that we can get the benefits for the city. Now, okay, Councillor Mahern can laugh, but at the end of the day, we should all be present here today for the benefit of the city, not for political gain. We should be here to do, I hope, that as plans chairs, all the plans chairs are doing what they think is the right development that's necessary for this city and all the time. And the officers are doing exactly the same thing. It's incumbent on all of us to start forgetting about politics for a minute when it comes to planning. We've had many controversies over the years about politics getting involved in the planning process in Leeds. Let's prove the people out there wrong. Let's prove them that we can work together, that we can come up with a consensus way forward, and that way we can then lobby ministers to actually go take down a cross-party support in terms of what's happening. The opportunity is there for us. If we choose just to carp on about it, as we often do in this council, or it's the nasty government all the time, this is an opportunity. If we don't take it, it's our fault, not that the government are giving us a chance in order to do something this time. Thank you.
Thanks, but I mean, to be fair, Barry, I think if we make that case, which we will, and the government doesn't listen to us, that's very definitely the government's fault. I think there is so many grave dangers with this white paper that, yeah, I think we're going to have to do the people's business, which I think we always endeavour to try to do, but we really have to do it for this white paper because it does give me serious, grave concerns going forward. Councillor Mulheron.
Thank you, Chair. I think there was a risk of us reaching consensus there before Councillor Anderson started moving away from that. I think there's everything in terms of Councillor Carter's original comments. The government white paper absolutely misses the point in terms of where the hold-up is in terms of house building delivery. And I would agree with him in terms of the fact that it's house builders, developers, landowners sitting on land with planning permission and not actually developing out those sites. That's the big problem. So I think we've got some room for agreement there. And also my white paper next week talks about the government working with councils and the LGA. So actually in terms of putting forward sensible suggestions, including the land tax that Councillor Carter supports, then I'm very happy to work cross-party in a small working group ahead of us putting in a submission. So I think there's definitely opportunity for us to reach consensus between now and whenever the development plan panel is meeting to sign off a consultation response.
Yeah, so, no, I completely agree, Lisa, thanks. And just bear in mind, folks, we will be, as part of the consultation response, yes, there are the questions, but we will also be wanting to set out what we would do, what we would see in its place. And I think that's really important. For example, affordable housing is still ill-defined, and the government's definition of affordable housing differs greatly from anything that could be termed by people in the real world as affordable. And we'll once again be making that case as part of this consultation response. There is clearly a lot of overlap, and officers have heard us loud and clear. Martin, Adam, could you just refresh, if there's no other elected member speaking, could you just refresh councillors' memories about what's the process and the timeline, folks, just to get clear in our heads?
So, Chair, the government's deadline is the 29th of October.
Yep.
And there's an intention to bring a fairly final draft which answers all the questions in detail to development plan panel on Tuesday, the 13th of October. Now, that would necessitate, if we were to keep to committee deadlines, that report having been drafted by Thursday, the 1st of October. So we really are looking at next week, the week of the 14th and the week of the 21st as being potentially the Monday the 28th as being the opportunities to have those further sessions.
Yeah. By further sessions, you mean either full DPP, or do you mean the working group we've floated as an idea?
I was meaning the working group that you floated, but that would be for yourself and Councillor Mulheron to determine.
Okay. Yeah, I think we have to meet that week, folks. Right. Mr. Feeney, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just to comment, I think in terms of pulling together a comprehensive response, there are a number of strands to it, aren't there? And I certainly support a cross-party response to it along the lines that Councillor Mulheron and other members have mentioned, because we do need to make sure that we have a response that is setting out how we think things can be improved in terms of the proposals, and also acknowledging where we think there are some benefits from some of the proposals, for example, increased use of digital technologies, etc., etc. So I think there's a balance between suggesting what we think it should be doing in terms of reform, and also recognising what might be strengthened or improved from some of the proposals that are there. I think the other thing to bear in mind as well in terms of the working group discussion is that there may be areas of activity beyond planning, which is complementary to planning and the delivery of some planning objectives, which also need to be acknowledged, because the white paper proposals and the questions, as we've had in the past with government consultations, are specific to particular aspects of those proposals. It takes you down a particular route in responding to those queries. There may be things beyond that framework and beyond that construct that we think planning should be about, or planning should be integrating with in terms of other ways of delivering on our wider council ambitions in terms of improving the existing housing stock or whatever it might be. And I certainly take the points about green space as had been mentioned this afternoon at this meeting, because those sorts of interventions in terms of structural change within compact urban areas require significant change, don't they, in terms of legislation and intervention. So if there are complementary pieces of legislation to planning that we can perhaps flag in our comments to the white paper, then that might be something that gives a more rounded view. I think in terms of the meetings, I mean, Martin has set out the timescale, and I think, you know, we're able as a service to help facilitate that, and dates can be circulated around, and we can set things up. Given the timescale, what we might want to think about is that if we are preparing a paper for the DPP deadline, there may be changes to the paper or updates to the paper following DPP between the 13th and the 29th of October. And it might be that any subsequent changes or additions could be agreed, Chair, through you and through Councillor Mulheron, so that we get, you know, as rounded and as detailed a response as possible within the time that's available. Thank you, Chair.
That's really helpful, David. Thanks. Yeah, we'll have to circulate dates. Just from elected members on this panel, just who's interested in participating in working group? That's myself, Councillor Mulheron, Councillor Anderson, Councillor Arif.
You can put me down as well, Chair.
Councillor Campbell, Councillor Carter, Councillor. Okay, it's a subcommittee of DPP there. Hey,
I did wave at you.
You did. I've got you. Got you all. That's excellent. Okay. No, that's really positive, folks. Right. I am acutely conscious of time at this point. David, Feeney.
Chair, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's all right.
If members are wanting this to be cross-party, are you wanting us, Chair, to approach groups who aren't represented in the meeting this afternoon as well to get any additional comments?
Yeah, I think would be the short answer. I think we absolutely have to be inclusive on this. So yeah, I mean, obviously there's quite broad representation on here already, but yes, of course, David. Yeah, no one exclude any political group on the council. So that's that. We'll circulate dates. Obviously, we've got to move fairly quickly on that. When the advantages of doing things by Zoom could be, we'll fall out of one meeting and into the next by not changing chairs, which is quite useful. We've had quite a lot of debate on this. I am conscious of time. Is anything anyone desperately wants to add right now, or can we wrap things up? I'm not seeing any indications, which I'm going to take as we can wrap things up. Yeah. Good. No areas, no AOBs, as they say at the end of meetings. Excellent. Okay. Well, listen, folks, thank you very much for that. That was a really useful session. We are going to run a wee bit over a Zoom time, but we're still within 5 minutes of an in-person time. And if Zoom is the new in-person, then there you go. We're within time. So thanks very much, folks. And have a safe journey home to your fridges to make a sandwich or wherever you're going. Thanks, folks.
Chair. Thanks,
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.